For our arts and culture series, Canvas, today we celebrate 50 years of hip-hop, a genre that's influenced every aspect of pop culture, fashion, and music across the U.S. and the world. It all started with a back-to-school party thrown by a young woman named Cindy Campbell on August 11th of 1973 in an apartment rec center in the Bronx in New York. To keep costs low, Cindy asked her brother, 18-year-old Clive Campbell, better known as DJ Kool Herc, to play music, improvising and playing breakbeats on two turntables in a continuous loop. And hip-hop was born. To help us appreciate the contributions of hip-hop, I spoke recently with Nelson George, author and filmmaker. He served as co-executive producer of VH1's Hip Hop Honors television show and also wrote the book Hip Hop America. I began by asking him about hip-hop's birth in the Bronx.
This was, the 70s where people say, the famous headline in the Daily News, Ford's the city dropped dead. There was a huge outflux, white flight out of the Bronx, the Brooklyn, particularly, and Manhattan. New York became one of the epicenters of the sale of heroin. So you had a lot of economic downturn. You had a lot of social ills. You had a lack of city services, right? You had a kind of city where what that meant that there was a lot of freedom. So you had the parties in the park where kids learned to break dance, they practiced emceeing, they played records, and you had graffiti, which was widespread throughout the city. So the things that made people say New York dropped dead, some of those same things gave a freedom to the city that allowed a lot of these street, or almost you might say folk expressions to happen.
So the music eventually evolves, right, to include lyrics. And I know a lot of folks will think of songs like the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight, but you have not just talking DJs now, but rapping MCs. And when you think specifically of songs like Run DMC's It's Like That, they're talking about really serious stuff. They're talking about unemployment. They're talking about financial troubles. They're talking about what it's like to not be heard and seen by society.
Right.
How did those kind of lyrics change the cultural place of hip-hop at that moment?
Well, hip-hop started as party music, but as it evolved, the idea that you could write about your personal condition outside the party, you could write about the world that was happening outside and the streets of New York and in your house. And then you had a movement that really happened mid to late 80s in New York, what a lot of people call the Golden Age, which is people like Chuck D and Public Enemy, KRS-One, Boogie Down Productions, Rakim, Big Daddy Kane. These were MCs who took the language, the language of speaking in rhyme over a beat, and added a level of poetry, added a level of politics, added a level of sophistication and artistic ambition that was different from the previous generation. So that's when you really had this really drilling down into the sociology of America.
There are those in American music circles who are convinced that in this country, rock and roll would always reign supreme. But it's fair to say by the 80s and into the 90s, you have these megastars, some of whom you listed there. You've others like Tupac and Biggie and Dr. Dre, and hip hop is firmly in the mainstream, not just in this country, but really globally. Why do you think that happened commercially the way that it did and when it did?
Well, I think the big turning point is the 90s, because the late 80s was always about there was only first. I'm the first rapper on American Bandstand. We have the first hip hop show on MTV. Then by the 90s, there was a critical mass. And there was a number of artists, you named them, can't leave Diddy out of this conversation. All of these artists were able to, and had the support. I think the key point I would say is they had the support of the record labels to go farther. In the case of Dr. Dre and Tupac had Interscope Records that distributed Death Row. In the case of Diddy and Biggie and a lot of their artists, they had Arista under the control of Clive Davis. They saw that hip hop was not just a music that could sell 1 million units or 2 million units. It could be something bigger. I think the other thing to be mentioned that everyone kind of leaves out of the conversation is MC Hammer. MC Hammer is kind of this bridge artist because he's not a great MC, but he's a great video artist. He's a great entertainer, performer. He sells a ton of records, I think almost like 10 or 11 million of his first album. I think Hammer's phenomenon was very important in the dissemination of hip hop as a pop expression.
Nelson, what about the role of women? I mean, it's worth pointing out that it took until the late 1980s until the first solo female rapper released her full album. That was MC Lyte back in 1988. How do you see the role of women in what was largely and is still largely a male-dominated field?
Well, the women are doing very well right now. I just think hip hop was very much a boys' club, and we used to say in the 80s that hip hop made girls into boys in the sense that you saw the baggy clothes. It wasn't, into my way of thinking, maybe I'm an old guy, it wasn't very feminine. It seemed like women were forced to conform to what was the standard of how people dressed. As time went on, more and more women began to express their sexuality, express their individual vision. I think, obviously Queen Latifah was a huge part of that. Lauryn Hill's impact, when you ask about female MCs, I think she's probably the greatest female MC to mine, both because of her actual artistry as an MC, her actual rhyme skills, and the range of topics and her writing, from the work she did with the Fugees and the score through her own album. And I think in many ways, her album, The Miseducation, is a landmark of the era. And it speaks to it sort of sets a template in terms of actual sales success that so many other female artists, singers and rap and MCs have followed in. So I think that Lauryn is a towering figure, both because of her skills as an artist and the fact that she had such a wide range of emotional and political observations.
So here we are marking 50 years of hip hop. What do you think the next 50 years bring?
I think probably other waves of music. Nothing is dominant forever, not particularly in pop culture. There'll be new expressions, stuff coming out of Africa. Afro beats is really a very powerful force. So it'll evolve. I mean, for me as a guy, I go back to like 78 with seeing Herc in the park. This hip hop that I love and that my generation came up on is nothing like what's on the radio now. So whatever we call hip hop depends on where you enter into the journey of hip hop.
Nelson George, this conversation was a real treat. You reminded me of some of my favorite albums over the years. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Be well.
I am Wonder Mike, and I like to say hello. To the black, to the white, the red, and the brown, and the purple, and yellow. But first, I gotta bang, bang.